Welcome back. Now, it's really common for all of us to experience memory loss from time to time. It can be caused by stress and anxiety, sleeping problems, just a natural part of getting older. But if you're becoming increasingly forgetful, particularly if you're over the age of 65, it might be an indication of early signs of dementia. Now, dementia is something that will affect 1 in 3 of us. And in a moment, we're going to get some advice from Jess Tobin, who's here with me from Alzheimer's Research UK, about some of the signs that you need to be looking out for. But first, I'm delighted to say that I am joined by actor and author Sir Tony Robinson. Now, Tony, sadly, both your parents had dementia. What was that like, living with them?
It was very, very difficult. And I think one of the things that concerns me most is that people who are caring for sufferers from dementia should understand that they need to look after themselves as much as they look after the person with dementia, because you do tend to feel very guilty, you tend to feel a failure, you tend to feel tired, you don't want to give yourself a break, very, very guilty. And I think one of the big flags to wave up is that actually everybody feels like that when they're coping with this problem. It's part of the human condition.
Now, you spoke about this really candidly and really openly on your podcast, Cunning Cast. But do you fear about your future? Do you fear getting dementia?
Yeah, of course I do. I feel much more confident than I did even 2 or 3 years ago, because there are these huge steps forward being taken in the research to Alzheimer's. At last, we're beginning to learn how to slow the disease down. We're beginning to be able to get blood tests, all those kinds of things. It's a very, very exciting time. And whether there is a genetic component to Alzheimer's, I don't think we're all absolutely sure about that. But if I am going to get it in 7 or 8 years' time, I'm sure I'll be in a much better condition than I would have 5 or 6 years ago.
And are you aware of some of the signs that you should be looking out for?
Yeah, so somebody at the Alzheimer's Society once said to me, look, if you forget your keys, then really don't worry about it. That's not Alzheimer's territory at all. When you need to start getting concerned is if you don't know where you are, or you don't know how you've got to where you are. I mean, that happens to all of us sometimes, isn't it? We just lose concentration. But really, it's not so much just being forgetful. It's a very different thing to that. And then when that happens, if you do feel concerned, go to your GP. If you can, go to one of those memory clinics, if there's one available near you, and they can talk you through it. That would be my suggestion.
Well, Jess Tobin is here from Alzheimer's Research UK. What are the signs that people should be looking at? I mean, Tony's laid that out quite clearly. What are the signs, though?
Yeah, so as Tony fantastically put, there are a lot of common symptoms that we can start to develop as we get older. And it is really important to go and get those checked out as soon as possible, because it might be something like a vitamin deficiency or thyroid disorder, which is treatable. So as Tony brilliantly put, starting to become a bit forgetful. So that might look like somebody becoming quite repetitive and starting to become quite confused in what can be quite familiar places, and things like processing and starting to be able to problem solve. So somebody might start to have difficulties with their finances. Any kind of long-term repetitive changes in behaviour, that's where you should go to the doctors and get it checked out.
Now, they say that dementia is the umbrella term. Yes. How many different forms of dementia are there, and what is the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so there's not a set number of types of dementia. So as you said, dementia is an umbrella term. So that's just used to describe the symptoms which are caused by physical diseases in the brain. So the most common type of dementia is Alzheimer's disease, and about 2/3 of cases in the UK of dementia are Alzheimer's disease. Then you also have things like vascular dementia, dementia with Lewy bodies, and some rarer types like frontotemporal dementia, which was the one that Bruce Willis was diagnosed with recently.
Now, Tony, you said that both your parents had dementia. We don't really know what type of dementia it was. This was sort of 20 years ago, but surely there were some signs there. And did you ever have a conversation with your parents about it?
People were so ignorant about Alzheimer's in those days. Really, even our GP really didn't know anything about it at all. The signs with my Dad were a real confusion and a real kind of panic. He phoned me up one evening and said, I know I ought to have all my cups pointing northeast, but I don't know which way northeast is, which was just a sad, worried, confused thing for such a clever man to have to undergo. None of my family had ever been to university. My dad got a place in London University, but he was a working class boy, and so he couldn't go. And he was really brilliant. So to see his mind disappear like that was absolutely tragic.
But did you ever have a conversation with them along the lines of, oh, Dad, some of this anxiety might be coming from dementia, or do you think perhaps you've got some issues with your memory, or did you just let it pass and try and, I don't know, be as natural with it as possible?
Absolutely the obverse of that. The idea of having conversations with a parent about a disease that you didn't know anything about was absolutely terrifying. So I did the kind of the blitz mentality thing. I said, oh, cheer up, don't worry about it. Everybody's like that. It's just, you know, you're getting a bit older. What should we do next week when I come round? La, 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 la. Now I understand that actually what you need to do if a loved one is showing worrying signs is go to somewhere like the Alzheimer Society, get help, get advice, go back to them and have the proper conversation. But in those days, no, we didn't do that.
Jess, you're nodding along. I mean, we do have a lot more information now, 20 years on, than Tony would have had. What would your advice be if somebody suspects a loved one or a family member is showing symptoms of early dementia, or maybe not so early? Do you broach that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, as Tony said, there seems to be a real kind of change in the tide at the moment around the general perception of dementia. I think even 5-10 years ago, there was much more stigma attached. People thought it was a normal part of ageing. And we at Alzheimer's Research UK are really starting to see people starting to come forward for a diagnosis, especially as there are kind of now drugs starting to come through the pipeline, which is showing that they have some effect on the progression of the disease. There's much more of an appetite for that diagnosis. So we would really recommend broaching that subject because there's much more that can be done the earlier somebody gets a diagnosis, whether that's the treatments that are currently available, which can help with some of the symptoms, whether that's putting care plans in place by talking to different charities and organisations that are available, or for people that are interested, the availability of taking part in clinical trials.
Okay, I'm just going to go to a call now. Steve from Wiltshire, do you have experience with dementia? Do you have a question for Jess?
I have a question for Jess.
Okay, what's your question?
Right, you know when you're doing puzzles and you're doing all these sort of things that keep your mind going and you see something and you don't know what the name is, but you know what it is, but not so long ago you would say, oh, that's that. And that's been happening to me quite a lot. I can see someone's face and I won't remember their name.
Okay.
And there's other things as well. And I just wanted, whether or not, what do I do if I get checked out?
That's a really interesting question. And also I'm sitting here thinking that happens to me. Tony's nodding along as well and wondering whether that happens to you. Yeah, so it can happen to a lot of people, but the frequency seems to be increasing for Steve.
Yeah, I think this is really important to note. So as you said, Storm, it does start to happen a bit more naturally as we get older, and it could be just a normal part of ageing. But what we really recommend is starting to keep a log or a diary and noting down when all these instances happen, and also if there are any other symptoms you're noticing. So it could be something that could be quite obscure, like changes in your sleep, or if changes in your kind of personality or interests. Just start to really keep a log and a diary, and if it's starting to happen frequently, and what we say is if it's starting to interfere with your daily life, that's really when you should go and get a GP checkup.
Does that sound reasonable, Steve? Keep a diary?
It definitely does, yes, and I'll do that.
Thank you so much for calling. Okay, you said to go to a GP. What are the waiting times for diagnosis? How quick is it to get a diagnosis from your GP?
Yeah, so the GP itself isn't usually the person that would make a dementia diagnosis. So usually once somebody goes to their GP, they'll do some initial tests, like quite a short thinking and memory test, and sometimes blood tests to rule out other conditions. They then will refer to a specialist. So like Tony said, it might be like a local memory clinic. So the waiting times are quite significant. So on average in the UK, for somebody over the age of 65, it can be up to 2 years. And if somebody's under the age of 65, so if they have a young onset dementia, it can be sometimes more than 4 years. So it is quite staggering. And that's something that us at Alzheimer's Research UK are really working with Alzheimer's Society and then IHR, we're looking looking at ways to improve the diagnosis process. So we're looking into these blood tests and hopefully kind of going to be integrating them into the NHS within as little as 5 years. So there are things that are improving in the general sector, but it is really long at the moment, unfortunately.
OK, back to calls. Paul from Easton Bartonshire, do you have a question for Jess?
Yes, I do have. My mum's got dementia and she's had it for a wee while, but there's actually no help for care. Like, for instance, we had to put a house up for sale for care. Now, I can't get any help on paying half the care fees or something. So I was just wondering if there's anything at all that people can get any help with once the money disappears or whatever before it disappears, what kind of help they can get, because I'm not getting anywhere, and even Eastern Bartonshire where I'm staying at, they're kind of slow in helping, and so whatever money I've got to sort of kind of try and find to pay bills.
Paul, I've got you.
Any help for that?
I wonder whether it's council by council as well, which would be very annoying. So obviously you can't tell them specifically on Eastern Bartonshire Council, but you must get a lot of people worried about finances. Where could they go?
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, Paul. And like Storm said, this is an issue which a lot of people face, looking after loved ones with dementia. The financial burden on families is really significant. So it's worth contacting kind of local organisations. So Alzheimer Society have information on what's available locally and how you can get financial support.
I'm just wondering, Tony, with both your parents having dementia in a time where we didn't know a huge amount about it, there wouldn't have been a lot of care or help for you either, or for your parents rather, but obviously if you're their main carer for you. How did you deal with that situation? Who looked after them? How was that operated 20 years ago?
It was very, very difficult. And quite honestly, I don't think the way that we had to cope with it is very different from how it is now. It's the biggest killer in Britain, and we still don't really have a national tactic for dealing with it, for giving support for people who are caring for those with Alzheimer's. There's two different things, and we've got to win both battles. One is getting a cure for the disease, or at least mitigating the disease, and the other is financial support. The idea that we have to wait up to 2 years for a dementia clinic for the biggest killer in Britain is absurd.
It does seem like a very long time and extra stress on families. I just want to read a social media message here that we've just got in. Sarah on Facebook says, my mum died after suffering from dementia for 10 years. It was very painful and her death was intensely stressful. Ever since, I have become obsessed in thinking I am going to go the same way. Oh, this is horrible to have to read. I wonder if you have any advice for me to combat this. I mean, this goes along with my question earlier to Tony, whether he's worried about himself getting it. What are the genetic relationships between dementia and, genetics and dementia?
Yeah, so directly inherited dementia is actually very rare, so it only makes up about 1% of cases. When we say directly inherited, that means that somebody in each generation of the family will go on to develop the condition at a similar age, and that's usually at a very young age, so as early as somebody's mid-30s. So that's directly inherited. But there are genes in the general population which are more common, which can increase our risk. So that's like the one that Chris Hemsworth got diagnosed with quite recently, where he found out he had an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. But it's really important to know that even if you do have these increased risk genes, that does not mean that you'll definitely go on to develop Alzheimer's disease or dementia. So what makes up our risk of developing the condition are a mixture of factors. So age is the most common risk factor, and then things like other health conditions, our lifestyle, environment, they all kind of play into it. So a report produced by Lancet, so this is this big organisation that review all the risk factors, found that up to 40% of dementia cases can potentially be prevented by these modifiable risk factors. So things like not smoking, watching your diet, exercising. So there are things that people can do.
What about, I was told once, and this could be a lot of rubbish, but doing Sudoku or crosswords or learning a new skill, line dancing, I know a lot of people take up maybe later in life because you can do that when you're less physically able, but it's still activating your mind. Do those things help, or are they?
Yeah,
is that rubbish?
So they're not linked to kind of scientifically backed risk reduction as such, but they play into something that we all have called cognitive reserve. And so cognitive reserve is our mind's ability to withstand the physical processes and changes in the brain. So we could have kind of the Alzheimer's disease happening in the brain, but if we've got a high level of cognitive reserve, we might not show those symptoms for much longer.
Okay.
So it's really important to keep your brain as active as possible, socialise as much as possible, especially as you get older, and try and keep learning new skills.
Tony, I know you're an incredibly social person, but do you try and keep up with all these things, keep a good diet to mitigate your risk factors?
Well, like everybody else, I do it patchily, but yes, I do it. The other day, I asked my wife where the scissors were, and I meant the stepladder. So no, I need to do a few more Sudoku to keep my mind a little more active. Yeah. Yes, exercise. Yeah, a much better diet. We all need to do that anyway, don't we? Particularly as we get older. So we should be doing that, regardless of whether or not we're worried about Alzheimer's.
I mean, if you have Alzheimer's or dementia of any kind, it is very stressful for the person going through it, I think, particularly at the beginning. But of course, Tony, it's incredibly stressful for their loved ones watching the person they love, essentially, if that's how you want to phrase it, disappear in front of them. I'm just wondering whether you have any advice for anyone that's out here that might be watching, maybe don't have a specific question to ask, but any advice on dealing with that?
Look after yourself. That's really the only advice that I can give. We're coming up to an election. If any politician, regardless of party, knocks on the door, say to them, what's your plan about Alzheimer's? If they don't know, if they're just embarrassed, well, maybe they'll start thinking about it. If they do know, then say to them, whatever party you are, make sure that in the next election term, there is more money going into Alzheimer's, particularly for research, particularly for looking after carers.
I do like that, look after yourself, because it's easy to forget yourself when you're caring for someone else. I'm sure you would agree with that, Jess.
Yeah, 100%. And there was quite a shocking statistic that came out last year from Alzheimer's Research UK around, so if nothing changes, 1 in 2 of us will be affected by dementia in our lifetime. So that's either developing the condition ourselves, being a carer for someone with a disease, or both. So it can actually be quite common that somebody cares for a loved one with dementia, and then following that, they go on to develop it themselves. So it is really important, as Tony says, to also prioritise your own well-being, because you're not going to be able to provide the best care and support if you yourself are not in a good place.
Just going back to that, I want to get as many of your questions as possible to Jess. So here's a message on Facebook. This is from Aaron saying, my late grandmother had it. We started to see signs when she got certain places mixed up and confusing taxi drivers. Interesting. It got to a stage where she said she was going to go to the market, but she got lost and the police found her near the dual carriageway. I mean, that's frightening. That was the beginning of the end. I mean, it's so difficult because it's progressive and it gets to a stage where people can't look after their loved ones, I'm presuming, at home. What do you do, Jess, if you're in a situation where you are living with someone that has dementia, that doesn't want to acknowledge it, that it can be quite potentially aggressive when you bring it up, but you're getting to this kind of stage where you need to bring in help? How can you introduce that?
Yeah, I think this is a really common issue, and it is really, really difficult to start having those conversations. Going back to keeping a diary and a log to try and keep track of all of the instances of these happening. If somebody's living with the early stages of dementia, quite often they won't notice these changes in themselves and they won't remember. So having kind of specific examples for when you broach these subjects, that can really help. Also seeking kind of medical advice and support from doctors. So there's an organisation called Dementia UK who have specially trained dementia nurses, and they can give advice around specific scenarios. But I think just to acknowledge it is a terrifying process going to get a diagnosis when at the moment there are no treatments which can slow and stop the condition.
Well, I've only got a minute left. I want to end on something quite positive now. There is headways in the area of dementia. You were speaking about drugs earlier. What can we look forward to?
Yeah, so last year we saw a positive results the first time from phase 3, which is the very end stage of clinical trials in humans for diseases that can, drugs that can actually slow down the progression of dementia for the first time ever. So we're currently waiting decisions from UK regulators, but these effects are the first generation of treatment. So it's important to say that their effects are relatively modest and they do come with side effects. However, the fact that we can even start to slow down this disease, when up until recently we thought it was a normal part of ageing, is incredible. And we've got 130 other drugs currently in clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease. So it's the beginning of a massive wave of treatments. It's an exciting time.
Well, that is an amazing place to end this conversation. Now, if you are worried, there is help out there. So Dementia UK is a national charity that aims to improve the quality of life for people with dementia. Specialist nurses can offer advice and support to families who are living with dementia. You can call their helpline number. It's 0800 888, so that's 38662678, 0800 888 6678. Email the helpline at dementiauk.org. The Alzheimer Society runs a Dementia Connect support line which provides information and advice about dementia, so you can give them a call 0333 150 34656. And for general information, you can also head to Alzheimer's Research website, which is alzheimersresearchuk.org. Okay, huge thank you to Tony and Jess for joining us and giving us all that information. Thank you for all your calls and questions too.